think of the scariest scene of any horror film, one that disturbs you, or leaves your heart racing. Odds are I can guess a trait of that specific scene you are thinking in your head right now. It involves a character or a group of characters in complete isolation. They're alone, and they're dealing with something that is unknown. Films are often observed together, with each audience member knowing that the film is that of mere fiction. So how do they create a fear response in the viewers? This is Isolating Terror, a look at the use of isolation and expressionism in Dario Argento's 1977 cult classic, Suspiria. When watching Suspiria, I wanted to know why exactly this movie scared me. What makes it just so unnerving? Looking through the vast catalog of pre-2000s horror films, I came across one that I'd like to compare against Suspiria in order to hopefully discover the roots of the horror within the film, as well as its influence on horror moving forward. That film is the famous John Carpenter slasher Halloween. Both of these films were made and released in the same era, but are drastically different in approach. But I found that they shared a very important similarity. First, I want to address the key difference between Suspiria and Halloween. The setting, or to be even more specific, the set. Suspiria takes place in Europe, compared to Halloween's setting being rural America. Now, this is important because it sets up the core foundation of the terror that is induced in Suspiria. A seemingly subtle detail like setting the story in Europe is more important than it seems. This is a distinction that separates the type of horror each of these two films produce. The European setting taps into the primal fear of the unknown with the viewers, and the film constructs its entire premise of horror on this notion. Not solely because the audience doesn't know where the characters are, but the familiarity of the setting is key, and is the first and biggest instance of isolation in the film. I then found that Halloween relied heavily on minimalistic stylization of its sets in order to make the film feel real, something that is polar opposite to Suspiria. Essentially, Halloween aimed to create the film in a familiar setting and built an entirely different foundation of fear using other tactics such as heightened suspense. Now, focusing on the set within Suspiria, I want to focus on a quote from Joshua Schultz's article, The Ornamental and the Monstrous, Exploring Feminine Architecture in Dario Argento's Suspiria, in which he says, his relationship with buildings and their interiors, it has been argued, seems bound by an obsession with disorientation and tension between conflicting styles, which are used to induce a state of anxiety in the viewer's failure to discern any feasible or temporal logic to the events on screen. This is interesting in regards to the use of isolation Argento uses. He places this character in an unfamiliar setting, like Europe, and then thrusts them into a set that harshly requires audiences to question what they are even seeing. Bright, vivid reds and greens illuminate each scene, and the walls are exploding with concentrated color. This is so unusual that audience members find themselves constantly drawn back to the set in order to try and resolve the anxiety that it creates. This is an intentional use of expressionism and can be argued is influenced by the famous 1920 expressionist horror film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a film in which it created most of its fear, using the distortion of sets in order to create uneasiness in audiences. This artistic style, in and of itself, is distinctly used to create a world that is similar enough to reality that it is relatable to the human psyche, but distorted enough that it creates anxiety. This is what Sigmund Freud calls the uncanny. In his book of the same name, he discusses that humans are mentally scared of things that are familiar but unfamiliar at the same time. Argento is effectively using Freudian psychoanalytic theory to scare people, and it works. This has been a prominent theme in literature, architecture, and film throughout history, and is known as the Gothic. The Gothic started as an architectural trend that featured sharp edges and points, as well as gargoyles and spires. Soon, books and short stories were being labeled as Gothic for their intense, dramatic, and interpersonal conflicts. As for the uncanny, there are several instances of it not just involving the set. The butler is made to look extremely ugly, and his presence is both familiar because he is a person, but unfamiliar because of his strange appearance. Or the cult-like meeting where the staff and students are circled up discussing the maggot infestation. It is evident that there is a historical and psychological imprint on the film itself, and it is this specific imprint that is manifesting fear responses in audiences. Juxtaposing this claim with that of Halloween's minimalistic style, it is evident that Suspiria derives its uniquely horrifying premise from its set. This isn't to say that Halloween isn't scary, but it is not scary for that specific reason. Within the set, Argento took these isolation tactics even further, with scenes like the one near the beginning of the film, where Pat is enclosed in her room. Pairing this with the abstract and brightly colored set is Argento's way of effectively pairing isolation and expressionism to create terror. He also uses cinematographic techniques to further isolate his characters, thus isolating the audience themselves. For example, the scene where Susie and Sarah are whispering together about who the head mistress could be, and if she were there at the academy with them, the topic is eerie, and Argento elevates the terror already presumed by contracting the frame down to just their faces. This eliminates the audience's ability to check the character's surrounding, and creates fear and anxiety as a result. This type of isolation is also seen when the blind piano player is walking through town with his dog completely alone. Argento cuts to an extreme long shot to show how alone he is, and then again contracts the frame down to a close-up in order to stress out audiences. This is that important similarity Halloween and Suspiria share. Throughout each film, the premise of horror stems from the isolation of characters. Argento pairs this effectively with Gothic and expressionistic sets to stimulate audiences' psychological fear of the uncanny. The film is terrifying not because of the supernatural plot, but because of the articulate and effective use of sets and cinematography. This as a result has influenced horror films for decades, and the techniques used by Argento can be seen on display in films to this day.